November 15th, 1944, Camp Forest, Tennessee. The examination room door opened, and she walked in like someone who had learned to make herself invisible. A young German woman, thin as winter branches, sat down on the wooden table and immediately shifted her weight. Something hurt, something she would not name. The American medic watched her flinch, watched her hands clasp tight in her lap, watched her eyes fix on the floor with an intensity that suggested she was reading a message only she could see. He asked simple questions in halting German. "Do you have pain? Any injuries?" She shook her head. No, nothing. But her body was screaming a different truth. If you're watching this story unfold from anywhere in the world, take 1 second to hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. It helps us tell more stories like this one. And drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. We read every single one. Now let's continue with what happened next, because when she finally spoke 5 words that barely qualified as a whisper, this medic would discover something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "It hurts when I sit." Those 5 words unlocked a horror. And in that moment, as he gently pulled back the collar of her prison uniform and saw what had been hidden beneath, this American medic understood something that would change how he saw not just this woman, but the entire machinery of war. The people who had done this to her were not Americans. They were her own countrymen. And what he found, carved into her flesh, was not just injury. It was a map of systematic cruelty drawn in scars. By late 1944, the war in Europe had become a grinding nightmare of collapsing armies and desperate regimes. Camp Forest, sprawling across 85,000 acres of Tennessee woodland, had been built hastily in 1941 as America prepared for war. Now it held over 12,000 prisoners, mostly German and Italian soldiers captured in North Africa and Europe. But the women were different. Female prisoners of war were rare, complicated, administratively challenging. Camp authorities had spent weeks preparing for their arrival. Special barracks, female guards, though never enough, medical protocols written and rewritten by officers who had no precedent to follow. When the transport trucks finally rolled through the gates on November 14th, 43 women climbed down into the cold Tennessee morning. They wore mismatched civilian clothes and fragments of uniforms. Some carried small bags. Most carried nothing at all. What struck observers most was their silence. These women did not speak to each other, did not look at the guards, did not react to commands shouted in broken German and impatient English. They simply moved through processing with blank efficiency, like people who had learned that compliance was survival, that invisibility was safety, that hope was a luxury they could no longer afford. Among them was Hannelore Zeidel, 23 years old, former clerk and radio operator at a coastal defense installation near Rostock. She had been captured by British forces in May and transferred through several camps before being selected for transport to America. Her identification card listed her occupation and capture date. It did not list what had been done to her. It did not describe the 7 months she had spent at Stutthof concentration camp, where guards did not need reasons to use their fists and boots, and worse. Leland Caraway was 28 years old when he volunteered to examine the German women. Tall, thin, with hands that trembled when he was nervous, but steady the moment they touched a wound. He had grown up in rural Virginia, the son of a country doctor who taught him that healing was not a profession but a calling. His commanding officer, Captain Vickers, had looked at him with suspicion when he volunteered. "You understand these are Germans, Caraway? Women who served the Nazi war machine. They're not victims, they're enemies." Leland had met his gaze without flinching. "They're patients, sir, and if they're wounded or sick, they're my responsibility." He believed something that most of his fellow soldiers thought naive, perhaps dangerous. He believed that enemy prisoners deserved the same medical care as American troops, not because the Geneva Convention required it, though it did, not because it might win hearts and minds, though compassion sometimes achieved what bullets could not, but because Leland believed that suffering erased the lines drawn on maps. That pain spoke a language older than nationalism, that a medic who chose his patients based on their uniform had abandoned the very oath he swore to uphold. The medical examinations began on the second day. Leland set up a rotation system, seeing patients one at a time in a converted storage room with a wooden table, a single chair, and a window overlooking bare November trees. The first dozen women showed predictable signs of wartime deprivation. Malnutrition was nearly universal. Ribs visible beneath skin that had lost almost all its fat. Respiratory infections from exposure to cold and damp. Dental problems. Minor injuries left untreated until they became major complications. Leland documented everything carefully, prescribed treatments with limited supplies, referred serious cases to Dr. Oswin Cardy, a white-haired veteran of the First World War who had seen enough suffering to fill several lifetimes. Then, on the afternoon of November 15th, Hannelore Zeidel walked into his examination room. She moved differently than the others, stiffly, as if her body were made of something more fragile than bone and muscle. She kept her spine unnaturally straight. When she sat on the examination table at his gesture, she did so slowly, with visible hesitation. Then she shifted her weight immediately, as if the position caused discomfort she could not hide. Her eyes never met his, not once. She stared at the floor with such intensity that Leland found himself glancing down to see if there was something written there. Her hands clasped tightly in her lap, knuckles white with pressure. Her breathing was shallow and controlled, like someone who had learned to make herself as small and quiet as possible. Leland spoke to her in his halting German, introduced himself, explained that he would perform a basic medical examination, asked if she understood. Hannelore nodded once, a tiny movement of her head, said nothing. Her silence felt like a wall built brick by brick to keep the world out and her secrets in. He asked the standard questions. Did she have any pain? Any injuries? Any medical problems he should know about? To each question, Hannelore responded with either a small shake of her head or a barely audible "Nein" that seemed to cost enormous effort to produce. But Leland had been trained to observe. When he asked her to take a deep breath so he could listen to her lungs, she complied. But he noticed the way she winced slightly, the way her left shoulder seemed to lock when she tried to expand her chest fully. When he gently touched her shoulder blade to position his stethoscope, she went rigid. Her entire body tensed like an animal expecting a blow. "Does this hurt?" he asked softly in German, keeping his hands light and visible. Another head shake, but her face told a different story. A muscle in her jaw twitched. Her breathing became even more shallow, and when he pressed gently on the shoulder joint itself, asking her to move her arm forward and back, the movement was restricted painful, accompanied by a sound she could not quite suppress, a small intake of breath that spoke of agony being carefully managed and deliberately hidden. Leland stepped back, giving her space. "I am here to help you," he said carefully in German. "You are safe now. If you are injured, I need to know so I can treat you properly." For the first time, Hannelore's eyes flickered up to meet his, just for a moment, just long enough for Leland to see what lived behind them. Fear, yes, but also something else. Something that looked like the terrible weight of a secret too heavy to carry alone, but too dangerous to share. Then her gaze dropped again to the floor. The wall rebuilt itself. The silence returned, thicker than before. Leland made a decision in that moment that would change everything. He could have noted in her file that she appeared healthy enough, showed signs of malnutrition like the others, and moved on to the next patient. He could have accepted her silence as an answer, but something in that brief moment of eye contact had communicated a plea that her words could not or would not speak. "I need to examine your shoulder more carefully," he said slowly. "I believe you have an injury there. It may be serious. I cannot help you if I do not know what is wrong." Hannelore's hands tightened in her lap. For a long moment she did not move, did not speak, did not even seem to breathe. The examination room was so quiet that Leland could hear the wind moving through bare branches outside, could hear distant guards shouting commands, could hear his own heartbeat pulsing in his ears as he waited for her to make a choice between continued silence and the terrifying vulnerability of truth. Finally, in a voice so quiet that he had to lean forward to hear it, Hannelore spoke. "Is tut way when it sits. It hurts when I sit." The words hung in the air between them. Leland felt something shift in his understanding. A shoulder injury that caused pain when sitting suggested damage that extended beyond the joint itself, suggested trauma to the back, to the spine, to the musculature connecting the shoulder to the rest of the body. It suggested an injury that had been severe, inflicted with force, and never properly treated. "Can you show me?" he asked gently, aware that he was asking her to cross a boundary she had fought hard to maintain. Another long silence. Then, with trembling hands, Hannelore reached for the collar of her prison uniform shirt and slowly, painfully, pulled it down to expose her left shoulder and upper back. What Leland saw made his professional composure falter. The shoulder blade was misshapen, sitting at an angle that was not anatomically correct. The bone had been broken and healed improperly, without medical intervention. The surrounding skin was marked with scars, long thin lines that had the distinctive appearance of wounds made by something sharp and deliberately applied. Wounds inflicted multiple times over an extended period. But it was the bruising that made his breath catch. Even weeks after the original injury, the discoloration was still visible. A sickly yellow-green stain spread across her shoulder and down her back, marking the ghost of violence that had been catastrophic in its force. Based on what he could see, Leland estimated that her shoulder had been struck with something heavy, a rifle butt, a club, perhaps a boot, struck with enough force to fracture the scapula and damage surrounding tissue so severely that sitting upright compressed the injured area against the chair, causing the pain she had finally admitted to feeling. "Who did this to you?" Leland asked, though he already suspected the answer. Hannelore's voice, when it came, was flat and emotionless, as if she were reporting on something that had happened to someone else in some other life. Ein Walkman, a guard. At the labor camp where I was sent before the coastal station. When did this happen? March of this year. 8 months ago. 8 months she had carried this injury without treatment, without care, without even acknowledgment. 8 months of pain every time she sat down, every time she moved her arm, every time she tried to sleep. 8 months of keeping this secret, because speaking about it might have invited more violence, more punishment, more attention from guards who saw prisoners not as human beings but as objects to be used and discarded. According to records later compiled by Allied investigators, more than 27,000 women passed through the Nazi labor camp system during the war years. The treatment varied widely, but reports consistently documented systematic abuse, inadequate medical care, and a culture of violence that was both casual and catastrophic. Leland examined the shoulder as gently as he could. Even his careful touch caused Hannelore to flinch, caused her breathing to become rapid and shallow, caused tears to form at the corners of her eyes, though she did not let them fall. The joint had limited range of motion. The bone had fused incorrectly. The damage was permanent in some ways, though with proper treatment, some function might be restored, some pain reduced. Why did he do this? Leland asked, though he was not sure he wanted to know the answer. Hannelore's response came in a whisper. I was too slow. I did not move fast enough when he gave an order, so he taught me to move faster. The clinical description of such brutal pedagogy made something crack in Leland's chest, made his hand shake as he reached for his notepad to document the injury, made him understand that what he was witnessing was not just one woman's suffering, but a glimpse into a system of cruelty that had operated with official sanction and without meaningful oversight. And he understood, too, that if Hannelore had hidden an injury this severe, there were likely others she had not yet revealed. Leland sat down his notepad and looked at Hannelore with careful attention. Are there other injuries? He asked softly. Other places where you're hurt? The silence that followed felt like a decision being made, like a door being slowly opened after years of being locked, like a dam beginning to crack under pressure. Hannelore's hands moved to the buttons of her shirt, trembling so violently that she struggled to unfasten them. When she finally pulled the shirt open and lifted the undershirt beneath, exposing her torso to the harsh electric light, Leland felt the floor seem to shift beneath his feet. Her body was a map of brutality. Long scars crisscrossed her back and sides, some old and faded to white, others more recent, still raised and pink. Scars with the distinctive pattern of being made by something sharp and flexible, a whip, a belt, perhaps a length of cable or wire. There were burn marks on her ribs, circular and deliberate, suggesting cigarettes or heated metal applied to skin. There were bruises in various stages of healing, from fresh purple-black marks to older ones turned green and yellow. Bruises that formed patterns, suggesting boots, fists, systematic violence over weeks or months. But worse than the visible injuries were the signs of what had been done internally. Her rib cage was grotesquely visible, each bone defined beneath skin that had lost almost all its fat. According to medical standards established by the International Red Cross in 1944, the minimum caloric intake for an adult female performing light labor was 2,000 calories per day. Leland estimated that Hannelore had been receiving perhaps half that amount for months, possibly less. There were also signs of infection, Several scars showed redness and swelling, indicating they had never healed properly. That bacteria had taken hold in wounds left untreated. That her body had been fighting a battle against sepsis without antibiotics or proper care. One particularly large scar across her lower back was weeping clear fluid. Infected and dangerous, the kind of wound that could kill if left unattended much longer. Leland felt tears begin to form in his eyes, felt them spill over despite his efforts to maintain composure, felt them run down his cheeks as he stood there, looking at the evidence of systematic torture, inflicted on a young woman whose only crime had been to exist in the wrong place at the wrong time under the wrong regime. He turned away for a moment, wiping his face with the back of his hand, ashamed of his emotional response but unable to stop it, unable to look at this suffering and remain clinically detached. When he turned back, he found Hannelore watching him with an expression of confusion and something that might have been fear. She was not accustomed to seeing her pain reflected in another person's face, not accustomed to having her injuries treated as something worthy of grief rather than indifference or contempt. Where did this happen? Leland asked, his voice rough with emotion. Stutthof, Hannelore said quietly. I was there for 7 months before they transferred me to the coastal facility. Leland knew the name. Stutthof had been one of the first concentration camps established by the Nazi regime, located near Danzig. It had held tens of thousands of prisoners over the years, political dissidents, Polish resistance fighters, Jews, and later women deemed useful for labor or who had committed infractions against military discipline. The camp had a documented mortality rate of approximately 65,000 deaths out of 110,000 prisoners who passed through its gates between 1939 and 1945. The guards there, Hannelore continued, her voice flat and emotionless again, they did not need reasons. Sometimes they beat us because we were slow, sometimes because we looked at them wrong, sometimes because they were bored and we were there. The story of Leland Carraway and Hannelore Zeidel shows how compassion survives cruelty. In camps built to erase humanity, violence became routine and unaccountable. Yet in a small medical room, care restored dignity. Leland treated wounds, documented truth, and chose mercy over hatred. Hannelore learned that suffering did not define her worth. Their brief connection proved that seeing another person fully human can heal bodies, soften trauma, and resist systems designed to destroy empathy. It reminds us that moral choice matters, even when history rewards cruelty and forgets ordinary acts caring.